So back in December, Blumhouse released another remake of Black Christmas. The original is a seminal work that a lot of people hold in extremely high regard. In fact, it's considered the godfather of the entire slasher subgenre. And for its time, it was a completely frank and adult-themed film. Today, many of the conversations that film was having happen around breakfast tables, so it has lost a little bit of its original edge. But it hasn't lost its power, and it remains a vital work of the genre. Remaking it was always going to be a challenge, an uphill battle, and Blumhouse arguably were not the right home for it anyway. Their recent output has been extremely slick crowd pleasers. So why am I talking about Black Christmas a couple months after its release? Well, the question that it raised, and the question that continually comes up in the genre is, can a horror movie truly succeed with a PG-13 rating? The answer to that is, well, there is no answer for it. Because the question itself is fraught with problems, and I can assure you that this video is not going to resolve this issue by any means. Hopefully, though, it'll give you some food for thought on a few different avenues. First, we have to consider what ratings are to begin with. The MPAA was, for most of my life, a voluntary but strong-armed organization. You didn't have to get your movie rated, not legally. They were not, strictly speaking, a censorship board, as in what exists in most of the world, especially in Britain and Germany. But what they were was a board that could give you a precious rating, and the exhibitors, that is the theaters, wouldn't take on your film if it fell outside of a certain range. Certainly an X rating was just the kiss of death for a commercial property. It was okay if you were producing pornography, of course, because X became synonymous with that form. But if you were a horror movie, there was a line to be walked. But where does that leave PG-13 horror? Well, we got PG-13 because there was films like Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which were considered too graphic for PG, but really not graphic enough for R. There was an understanding that they would appeal to teenagers, and it was an attempt to let their parents know that this film was probably okay for them, but you might want to check it out. Make sure that it matched your values before you bought that ticket for your son or daughter. That was the intention of PG-13, to say to parents, this is probably okay, but be cautious. R, on the other hand, it was meant to say, this is a work for adults, and if you really think your kids can handle it, bring them on in, but we're warning you, it's for adults. As time went on and generations changed, not everyone took the rating system seriously, and there was a lot of concern by the late 80s that the R rating had lost its meaning. Many in the horror community were pushing for an A rating to be created, which would stand for adult, which would signify a film for adults, not for kids, but it wasn't pornography. So a film like George Romero's Day of the Dead would finally have a home and a commercially viable pipeline. It didn't happen. Many years later, we did get the NC-17, which has become a completely meaningless rating because it's simply not used. The theater chains don't know what to do with it, and because the market for these films are so small, the distribution companies really don't want to pony up for any real advertising on the title that has such a minute audience. So an NC-17 film ends up cut to an R. Through the 90s, a different thing happened, and the R rating loosened up. There's a lot of corporate reasons for this, and many of them have to do with changes of leadership at the MPAA. But what did happen is that you could now release a film with some graphic bloodshed as an R. It wasn't the impediment that it was in the 80s. So, Black Christmas. Remember, that's what this video is about. Black Christmas as a title means something to the core group of slasher fans, and to horror film fans in general to a lesser extent, but to the main general movie-going public it means very little. It's not a title like Halloween or Friday the 13th. It doesn't conjure up that direct intel from a general audience. There's not that recall of exactly where you were the first time you saw it, to the average film goer who sees whatever the popular film is, or whatever made it onto cable that month. So it's a different world, and it's a different title, and that's where we come to the remake and the controversy. The question is, can a PG-13 horror film succeed, creatively, commercially, and most importantly, is it healthy for the genre? And With that backdrop out of the way, the simple answer is you can't talk about the horror genre as one thing. So many will point out that there has been plenty of successful PG and PG-13 horror films over the years. In fact, really until the 1970s, all the horror films that came out were safely PG. But there's a little bit of a wrinkle there. There were, of course, rare exceptions like Psycho or Night of the Living Dead, but in general, horror was thought of as monster movies, and monster movies were for kids. Come the 1970s, that changed. Horror films were now bloodier and nastier and grimmer, and they had exploitation elements in them, such as nudity and adult themes, that hadn't existed during the earlier periods for the genre. Or where they had, they'd been masked in subtext. And that leads us to the question of the original film. The original film is rated R not for any one single death scene or for any specific scene that would be blatantly adult. It's for a general sense of adult nature. And I think you and I both understand that your average 11-year-old has no interest in the themes or the execution of the film Black Christmas. It's not an easy movie in any regard. So when a remake is announced, it feels wrong to hear the PG-13 rating attached to it. And there's something to be said there. Poltergeist, existing as broadly a haunted house movie, could be PG-13. There's no conflict there because there's nothing intrinsic about the material that requires the bloodshed or the nudity or the adult themes. That's not true of the slasher genre. The slasher genre is built out of the exploitation elements that the genre sometimes revels in. It's difficult to imagine a PG or even PG-13 slasher really succeeding. Now, that said, there have been some, including a few really good films. The Final Girls comes immediately to mind. But every time there's a gimmick involved that makes it really a wider appeal than simply to the horror subgenre. And that's what this all really comes down to. When the Black Christmas remake came out, it was explicitly stating that its audience was not the hardcore slasher fan. They didn't mind if those guys were on board, but it was a film that was using the slasher genre to do something else. And that by itself can be problematic. Now, it can also succeed wildly and create cult classics. But the danger is, if that becomes commonplace, a big part of what has made the subgenre so special will deteriorate. And for a certain group of fans who endured the editing at the hands of distributors who desperately needed the MPAA's approval, those fans didn't want to see the slasher film watered down again. Now, for even more commercial reasons, I'm not going to get into the producers or directors' reasons why they felt that this was the right move in this case. Maybe it works commercially, maybe it works creatively, and maybe it doesn't. I don't know. I've not seen the movie, although I do intend to at some point. What I can tell you is that this is not an argument born out of any sort of resistance to the PG-13 rating itself. It's specifically about the limiting nature of PG-13 on the subgenre of the slasher, and as a result of the legacy of the original title, which was so important in building that foundation for what we think of in the slasher subgenre. Does that mean we should all riot every time some film is announced that's PG-13? No, this is case by case. All film is. But it does mean that when a distributor releases a film, they are telling you who they intend the film for. And if that intention is for a 13-year-old, well, that's going to have some limitation on the audience. This isn't Pixar that can appeal to 65 and to 8-year-olds. The slasher subgenre, by its nature, by the themes of mortality and morality that it plays with, is always going to be at an uneasy juncture when it comes to the rating argument. You'd be wrong to say you couldn't make a successful slasher film that was rated PG-13, but you'd also be lying if you pretended that the majority of successful slasher films that have ever been released had anything but an R rating. In fact, if you look at the major franchises in the slasher subgenre, you don't see a lot of PG-13 titles. A final thought. As a guy who has created inside the genre, I have to say I don't like the idea of any limitations. While I don't like the idea of the slasher subgenre having its traditions torn out from under it, I do understand too that we don't want to, stop the progress of the subgenre. We want it to continue to grow and build. We want new and dynamic ideas, and some of those ideas may take us into territory that we're not expecting, including to the PG-13 rating. There's not necessarily something wrong, but if I can posit a little bit of my personal opinion into this argument, I would say this. When you take an existing property, you have to face the facts that the fans have owned this title in their heart and minds for a long time. It's a little bit harder to create that new paradigm shift for an existing genre if you're using a title they recognize. That comes with baggage and it comes with expectations. And maybe it comes with a little bit of what got you into the horror genre to begin with. Companies should think about what that means before they make a decision like to release a film as PG-13. There's a lot of kids who'd like to see these movies, but who are we fooling? As soon as it hits streaming, they'll be able to. The theater-going experience seems to be on the decline, so maybe ratings themselves are on the decline. Maybe this argument will be irrelevant in a couple years, or even less. I'm not so certain that the question is what letters are placed in the corner of the poster, as much as it is who owns the horror genre, who is the caretakers. In that respect, it's not the filmmakers, and it's not the distributors, it's not the right holders. The horror genre, more than any other perhaps, belongs to its fans. Its fans are a hardcore bunch that really do care. And when they have arguments, don't be quick to dismiss them. And don't be quick to shake your head at them or wag a finger or tweet. In truth, the reason they care is because this is a genre that has formed a lot of who we are in unexpected ways. But when you go into that fight, understand this is not something we take lightly. And it's not something that you should either.